Hello, everyone, and welcome to another K6 Office Hours. As always, I'm Nicole van der Hoeven, and today I'm joined by two of my colleagues.
Which
Hey, my
one's gonna
name's
start?
Marie. I'm we always do this like every single
I
episode.
know. When will we get
But
better?
I know. Yeah, but yeah, I'm Marie. I'm one of the dev roles here at K6.
And I'm Théo. I'm an engineer at K6 and I'm a maintainer of the K6 open source project.
Awesome. So, Theo, we've had you on before, 42 episodes ago. You were on the 40th office hours, and that time you were talking about scheduling in K6. I think we
Mm-hmm.
talked about executors, stages, scenarios, and what's been happening since then. What have you been
Quite
working on?
quite a lot actually. We actually modified how thresholds work under the hood. We delivered, on top of my head, like I worked on Redis, for instance, and now there's like native support for Redis. We delivered tracing. And really, I've been working a lot on the extension ecosystem. Also AWS, like we have support for AWS now in scripts. Some parts of AWS, because it's just me working on this. So yeah, quite a bit.
Just in case people haven't watched that last one, can you talk a little bit about yourself and your background and what you like
Sure.
to do?
So I've been doing this job for close to 15 years now. I've been using the language that K6 is written in for since its first release, actually. And before that, I used Python a lot. I worked in a variety of companies. I worked in the press. I worked in the music industry. I worked in data analytics, in a networking company, things like that. And I like to call myself a hacker, but in the sense that I'm a generalist. I like to do a lot of things, but I'm not an expert at anything, really. I wouldn't even call myself an expert at K6, although I'm a maintainer. But yeah, that's basically me.
That's awesome. I think it's funny that a lot of experts just call themselves generalists. And really what
Yeah.
that means is I probably know more than most, but don't at me if I say something wrong. This
It's
is a
more of
safe
that like
space, Teo.
awkwardness. Yeah, it's more of that awkwardness as well. Like when you refer to yourself as, oh, hey, I'm an expert at this. Like it just doesn't feel when you say it. But so maybe, yeah, like the better term would be generalists or maybe like advocates as well. But yeah, even with me, I feel a bit no when someone says, "Hey, are you an expert at this tool?" and I'll be like, "No, but I've used this tool a lot." It doesn't necessarily mean that we're experts.
Well, we're all just learning here. And I know for me, especially, I am really excited to learn about what we're talking about today because I have used it briefly, but there have been quite a few updates in it. Teo, can you tell us what are experimental modules in the first place?
Sure. So maybe I realize that very often it's not quite clear, even to myself, on top of my head, what a module means, because in the K6 ecosystem, we have modules, we have extensions, and we have JavaScript libs that we call JS libs. And I think this is the key aspect of experimental. So we have this ecosystem of extensions, which is essentially we allow users to build new features for K6 that suits their own needs without having to modify the K6 code base. And so we have this whole ecosystem that's built on top of a tool called XK6. And we actually realized while talking to clients and while talking to our open source users that some features were very much requested and that they were constantly coming back in the stream of the discussions. And so also to be able to move faster towards adding more functionalities to K6, we decided, I think maybe 9 months ago or something like this, that we would start an experimental branch in the core of K6, so really in the tool itself, not as extensions. We would start ingesting some of these high quality extensions that we think actually align with K6 goals into the core of K6 itself. And we call it experimental because we want to make sure those are high quality. And to do that, we need the input from our user base. And we need to also take the time, give them the time to stabilize.
I think it's a really good sign of maturity for the K6 ecosystem because I remember that when we first released the ability to create extensions, it was just like a fire hose of stuff, which is great, but it's also difficult to judge the quality of them because they were all really experimental to some degree. But then some of them started to rise to the top as extensions that really everybody used a lot. I know that there are some that I personally always use, and I would really prefer to have an easier way to use it with K6 because you as a tester, I had to figure out how to build a custom binary of K6 using Go. And, not everybody knows how to do that. Not everybody's a Go developer. So that was one of the things that I struggled with when I first started using extensions. How about you, Marie?
Yeah, I was just gonna say I remember during my week of load testing, because this is my first experience with Go. I predominantly come from a JavaScript background, so the whole experience of trying to build a custom binary of K6, it was pretty new to me. And so I remember I was having not really difficulty, but I had to really read a lot about it, like why we had to build custom binary. Why can't I just use it as like for me, like simply installing a package that I can just easily use with K6. So there's that initial setup. That I felt was maybe it might be a bit too long for some of the users. Yeah, so that was my first impressions of it as well.
So, Teo, you mentioned that the way that we decide what becomes an or an experimental module rather than an extension is that they have to be high quality. What does that mean, and who actually decides that?
That's a very good question. And I think I need to preempt the discussion by mentioning that the process around experimental modules is not itself stabilized. It's still quite experimental. So we haven't made clear-cut decisions around questions like what's high quality, how long does it take for an experimental module to become stable, and things like that. But I guess our baseline is on the open source side, we recognize that some of our users, some of them corporate, some of them individuals, have spent a lot of time and effort and maintain regularly their extensions. And we want to consider if that aligns with the K6 goals, whether or not they and us would be open to actually integrate that in the core. Of course, it comes at a certain cost because the core is maintained by people who are working inside of the K6 organization and inside of Grafana, and we're on the payroll, and whatever we merge inside of the K6 core, we will have to maintain. So there's a sense of ownership, of course. But the bottom line is there's, on the open source side, high quality things that have been maintained and that everyone uses, basically. But on the other side, on more of like the corporate and more business aligned aspect of things, we care to include or develop extensions that align with our business goals. So for instance, a lot of our users were asking for Redis support, and you could get some Redis support through tips and tricks, but that's not very accessible unless you spend quite some time into it. And we decided, okay, so it's a recurring request, we need to work on it. And so we developed it, and now it's an experimental module. But I think down the line, we're actually looking at maybe selecting certain very, very famous feature requests for, I don't know, certain protocols or certain technologies, and either decide to develop it ourselves or partner with outside individuals or corporations who have already worked on it to maybe integrate it in the core.
So we are now on K6 version 0.43. And I had a look, and experimental modules were first introduced in 0.40. So it's been a few cycles of it. And I thought we could look at what the state is now. So these are the experimental modules. You can look this up in docs. Let me just put that into the chat as well so people can see where to have a look for the documentation. But these are the modules that are out now: browser, Redis, timers, tracing, and WebSockets. So I believe that the browser and tracing modules were just introduced in this last version. Is that right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. So maybe we can talk a little bit about each of these and what they do.
Which one do you want to start with?
Let's start with Redis.
Okay. Yeah, Redis is exactly what you would think it might be. So basically what it allows you to do is to talk to a Redis instance or a Redis cluster and to interact with it from within your scripts as you would do in any other language or other platform. So from a K6 script, you can fetch data, you can insert data, and you can essentially use it as a data storage, or you can actually test your Redis instance if that's something you're interested in. But yeah, it's not full featured, but I think it's maybe 70% of the features, of the main features of Redis. And yeah, that really either test your Redis infrastructure for its performance or use it as a data backend. For instance, if you have huge data sets that don't fit in memory or that are fitting in huge files that K6 cannot handle on a single machine.
Okay, awesome. And then what about timers?
Timers is essentially a very, very tiny module that we have introduced to be on par with the functionalities, JavaScript functionalities that you would expect in your standard JavaScript environment, whether it is the browser or Node.js. And this was made possible by the recent introduction of asynchronous APIs in our JavaScript runtime. So we don't actually use V8 like a lot of other tools do out there, nor Deno. We have our own JavaScript runtime. And now that it supports asynchronous operations, these features were very, very fundamental. They essentially allow you to delay operations and to say, well, do something in X seconds or something like that.
Should we move to the next module?
Yes, sure. What about WebSockets?
So basically we had, if you've been around for long enough, we already had some support for WebSockets, but it had some limitations and it was not fully compliant with the specifications. With the specification. And I never used the older version, so I'm not the most aware on this, but I believe it was not, well, the way it was asynchronous was a bit of a cheat code. This is a fully compliant implementation of the WebSocket specification, sorry. And it also uses our newly introduced asynchronicity support in the JavaScript runtime.
Okay, and this is going to be really good as well because I know a lot of the scripts, I think majority of the K6 scripts that we see are HTTP based, but certainly WebSockets, that's probably one of the next ones.
Absolutely. I think, like you said, HTTP is the most used module of all, at least in this domain. But I think the second and the third are by far WebSockets and gRPC. I don't have the actual data, so please, don't send Demon to chase me if I'm wrong. I might be wrong, but they're very likely the two next on the list of most famous modules.
Okay, now we get into the ones that have just been introduced in the last version. And the first one is tracing. What can you tell us about tracing?
So I'm going to start with a disclaimer. I implemented this module. I know the specifications, but I never used tracing myself before. So what I'm actually explaining, I know how it works under the hood, but I don't know how people use it yet. It's something I started getting interested in recently. But essentially, as a user, what it allows you to do is to attach a trace context to HTTP requests that you perform. So some of our users in the observability space want to actually trace requests through their whole stack of microservices or their whole infrastructure. And they're interested of seeing, where am I actually spending the most time? So am I spending a lot of time fetching, I don't know, like the user account or logging in or maybe getting some whatever database transactions? And to be able to do that, the actual surface for the client to be able to do that is to attach a header to their HTTP requests, or a set of headers. It depends on the specification. And so now we've introduced this experimental module that lets you do that completely transparently. So that was a bold decision on our side, but we think it's the best API to do that. You can, like you have on screen, you can essentially use the module and call this instrument HTTP method on it, function, sorry. And you can decide on the propagator. By default, it's going to use W3C. So that's like the main specification that's out there for tracing. And from there, for the rest of your script, you don't have to change anything. Everything is going to be done magically. Tracing information are going to be added automatically for every HTTP request that you do, so that your tracing backend, like Tempo, for instance, from Grafana, will be actually able to detect them, to list them, and extract the information to display tracing information to you. Does that make sense? Because I never do.
Yeah, it does make sense. Okay. But I also want to ask a question that maybe I should know. What is the difference between this tracing experimental module and the K6 by Tempo one that we have, like the extension or integration that we have? Is it just that one is more Tempo specific, or is there a bigger difference?
I don't want to pretend I have a precise and absolute answer on this, because I don't know that module, but my assumption and intuition there is that our module is about supporting the general specification. So tracing is done through a set of steps, essentially, and through a set of information that you attach to requests. And this is generally specified. And this is what this module does. So if you have a backend that supports this, I think right now we only support W3C and Jaeger, you can use our module for that. But what happens once the traces end up in a system like Tempo is specific to the implementation, to a backend, basically. So you have a site that sends the requests with information, and you have the system that receives them and is going to actually filter them and try to figure out what to do with them. So I don't know the Tempo module. I am guilty of that. I will for sure go check it out afterwards. But I think that's the main difference. So ours is about supporting the open specification, and I imagine the module that's more specific to Tempo is just that, more specific to how the Tempo backend handles traces. But so if you're, sorry.
Is the tracing experimental module, does that come from this other extension, XK6 distributed tracing?
Yes. So we haven't discussed this explicitly, but a lot of the implementation from the tracing module comes from this extension. So I took the liberty to change some of the concepts, some of the abstractions, and we had this clear vision for an API, which is this famous instrument HTTP function. But a lot of it, there's a lot in common between the two.
Okay, and we have a question from Maximilian Haupt. If I understand it correctly, you attach the trace headers to the outgoing requests. Assumption is that the backend application knows about these headers and forwards them as well. Do you have a method for gathering the resulting trace data?
So that's a good question, Max. I worked with Maximilian in the past, so I'm happy to see him there. That's exactly what tracing backend such as Tempo is doing. So essentially, you install an agent. In our case, it's the Grafana agent in your infrastructure, which is in charge of doing exactly what you are explaining there. So it's actually looking for this HTTP headers in this case, and it's going to feed them into the tracing backend, which has a very nice interface. I really invite you to go check it out. A very nice interface to be able to actually look at each request individually or more generally and inspect how much time and essentially performance was spent at every level inside your infrastructure and your stack.
Yeah, I just also wanted to highlight that this is the beauty of us using open telemetry and standards that are already out there. We're not creating our own thing. And so, like Maximilian is saying, the assumption is that the backend application knows about these headers. Well, if you're using one of these standards, then it will. So yeah, Tempo is great. I know some people use Jaeger as well. But that would probably be the best way to gather the trace data.
Yeah.
All right. And then, well, one of the three of us is particularly excited about this one. So the next one, the latest experimental module that's been released is the browser module. Can you tell us
Yeah,
about it?
you saved the best for last. Yeah, I mean, this browser module, so this is really our module that provides browser level API, so we can also start doing browser automation and front end performance. We've also introduced this in like several K6 office hours episodes, but previous episodes, I think we were still demoing it as an extension. So there's a lot of new changes as well in terms of like this browser module, such as the import path has now changed. So it's now following, I guess, the experimental format. And with the great addition of the async and await syntax. So, for example, in this simple browser test, you can see that we're now also leveraging this syntax to make I guess waiting for operations much more simpler, much more easier to understand, because um I guess with like if we're just gonna use promises, it's I think if we really want that, great developer experience and easier to read, I have to admit myself that, promises are not the easier to understand, especially if you have a lot of promises that you have to chain together. It can get really, really long. You'll see a lot of dot then, functions. Whereas with await syntax, it makes it look like the code is synchronous, although it's actually asynchronous. So it just makes it more simpler. So it's great that K6 also has native support for async and await. So it will make the browser automation in terms of the test scripting much simpler as well.
Théo, I'd love to get your thoughts on async await. Maybe you could explain it. What does it mean for something to be asynchronous? Oh,
You're
you're on
muted.
mute.
Sorry.
He doesn't want to talk about
My bad.
async.
No, never. I think Mary's frustration with very, very long promises is a good starting point, because it's as soon as you work with asynchronous code that doesn't have the async await syntax. Nowadays, it's very common, but for a very long time, it wasn't. You end up in the situations where, and I had it before the async await with Redis, for instance, where you make chains and it lasts forever. So essentially, the async await syntax is about instructing the JavaScript runtime. So basically, the virtual machine that runs the code, you tell it, go start doing this. And as soon as you see the await word, put it on the side, keep doing it, and wait that the operation is done, but you're allowed to do anything else at the same time. So essentially, it looks synchronous, just like Mary said. It looks like every step happens one after the other, but it also allows to let other code that's somewhere else to do something else at the same time. And I think the main gain from it, and I very much benefit from it when I write extensions that are asynchronous, is that I don't have to think anymore about, okay, I do a then, and if I need to do another then inside, then okay, but where am I, and so on. Await basically removes that. So it's an optimization, and it's also a very nice UX. So you don't even need to know that it's asynchronous, apart from just knowing that the API itself requires you to use await, but you don't need to know how it works under the hood anymore, because that effectively becomes much of a detail. And I think that's the main power of it.
One
I
of the
think as
reasons that I'm
well.
excited
Oh,
about async await is that I think it just mimics more closely what real users are doing. Like from a testing perspective, if you don't have async await, it's all synchronous, or another word could be maybe sequential. And people aren't like that. We are capable of doing more than one thing at once, sometimes to our detriment. And so, like a common use case in testing is, maybe waiting for an element to be displayed on the page, but that doesn't mean that the user is just going to wait for that thing to come up. Normally we're already scrolling down and trying to skim the rest of the page. So I think that async await from a testing perspective opens up the possibilities for more realistic testing.
yeah.
And I would agree.
It's yeah, and I think as as we go forward, because I remember when I started with JavaScript, promises were introduced to improve the callback way of handling asynchronous code. And like when I worked with callbacks before, that was way too confusing for me. And then promises were introduced, and then after that, they've introduced async in a way to make it more simpler. So I think it just shows that even when writing code, there is a focus on making sure that we have higher quality, higher maintainability, higher readability as well, to make sure that developers also have that great UX, like Theo has mentioned already.
Okay, Marie, we have a
We have
question from
question, yeah.
Alien FPV. Oh, sorry. Do you want to
Yeah.
you want to read it out?
Yeah, so he's asking, how much would you recommend using chaijs for browser level automation? If tests are failing, we wouldn't know if using only check. This is a really great question, and I remember when we talked about chaijs on the previous um, office hours. So K6 actually has support as well. So we have our own version to basically integrate the chaijs library to make it more I guess in terms of like the behavior driven development approach. And I remember when I did my week of load testing that I didn't even use check for my assertion. I instantly just used the K6 chai.js module, because it was very like familiar to me. And I guess with that type of test where if something is failing, then um if you're if what you're trying to test is some browser like actions, like what your users are actually seeing, then it makes sense to have your test failing. Whereas if you use check, then it might still continue to execute the rest. So I guess, yeah, it's just a matter of like preference as well. But I remember even our CTO, Pavel, he said that if he's gonna do some browser tests, his first choice would be to use the K6 Chai.js plugin.
So this is the video that Marie mentioned where our CTO Pavel Suvala was talking about, and Marie as well. We were talking about BDD and in particular K6 Chai JS. So yes, indeed, that would be a great supplement to testing to functional testing and automation testing using K6. But we have a question from another one from Maximilian. Stupid question, by the way. No stupid questions. The only stupid ones are the ones that don't get asked. So thank you for asking. Is the goal of the browser module to mimic something like end-to-end tests, and then the main goal is still to performance test the back end? Or is it about testing performance of the front end, or both together with a trace module? So I can take this one. I think one of the best parts about K6 is that we don't say it's only for these use cases. It can be for a lot of use cases. It can be for both back-end testing, back-end and front-end performance testing, and even like functional or automation testing. So we're not restricting ourselves to any one use case. Personally, I think that that is one of the strengths of K6. The scripts are reusable. You could have like an automation test suite that uses the K6 browser module. You could reuse some or all of that for a performance test of the front end. You could use it to drive a little bit of back end load. Although I will say as a caveat that if back end performance testing is your main goal, then I would say reduce, like only have a small number of users using the browser module, just because it is more resource intensive, and then you can still use the the back end, the API tests to drive majority of the traffic. And you can also have that it work in conjunction with the tracing module. Do you two, Teo and Marie, agree with that?
I think yeah, it would be a great project to do, because I remember even with the chaos extension, like we want to have like just a simple project where we want to see how browser module and the chaos extension works together. So perhaps we can also have a similar approach with tracing and the browser module. But yeah, it's definitely a use case, and now that both of them are modules, you can just easily combine them in a single script.
Okay, Marie, did you want to show us about some more things that we can do with the browser module now? Because there have been quite a few differences, right?
There has been. So let me just see if I can make this a bit bigger. Is this font size okay?
Looks
Yeah.
good.
So I guess one of the first things, so if you were already using the browser module, you'll notice that the way you're importing Chromium is now different. So now you have to use K6 experimental browser. But I guess so if you're still using like older versions of K6, so you have to make sure that you're using version 0.43 and above to have this experimental module bundled in natively. This part here, so this is already an existing way of doing things. So what I'll do now is I'll show how we can use the async and await syntax. So previously we were just using promises. So you'll have page.goto and then dot then, and then you'll do the particular action that you want once the promise has resolved. But now we can just easily add the async keyword. So this is basically saying that this should return a promise, and we should wait for this particular operation to finish before we can proceed into executing the rest of the code. Because the main benefit as well is, let's say you want to visit a page and then you have other lines of code where you want to click on a particular element. Then if you don't have the await syntax, it might execute the click operation first, even though the page that go to operation hasn't fully finished. So for a first time user, this might look like it's executing it synchronously, but actually it's an asynchronous operation, and it's just trying to make it appear as synchronous to make it simpler. So the test application that I'm just going to show, so it's just a very simple um, website. So what I want to try and automate is, let's say, if I click, this particular product, and if I add, let's say 3 as a quantity. So let's say you want to test that, is there any user or is there any browser error that you're seeing if you try to add more than one items in your cart. So if I press add to cart button, the expectation should be I should be on this shopping cart page, and I should see the correct item. And currently this is set to 10 because I was playing around with this a while ago. But basically, what I'll do is I'm just going to copy the different selectors. So this is pushed to my GitHub project. So if you're interested to see, how it works, if you want to play around with it, it's all pushed to a GitHub project that you can try and access. So let's just say, we want to mimic the action where you want to click the first item that you saw on the cart, and then you want to select the drop down quantity and then select the option of 3, and then just go ahead and click the add to cart button. So again, using the async and await syntax, we have some operations that are asynchronous, such as the locator.click actions. There are still some that's not fully asynchronous, but we are working our way to also convert those operations to async. So you'll notice that with the select option, we still don't have the await syntax. I think at the moment, like page.go to, if you want to wait for the page navigation as well, that's also using the await syntax. And if you're trying to click on like certain operations, that will also have the await syntax here. And after I've done that, so in this particular example, I'm just using the check, but like what we've discussed a while ago, you're also free to use the K6 chaijs plugin to make it, more familiar. If you want to, like if you're already familiar of using like popular libraries like Mocha, then it's very easy to also do the same in K6. But for now, I'm just using the default check that comes with K6. So just go ahead and copy that. And when you're finished, we can just say we want to close the page as well as the browser. Go ahead and save that. The other change as well that we've introduced. So if you were using K6 browser as an extension, you don't really have to set any environment variable. But if you're using it as part of K6 version 0.43, there is an environment variable that you have to set. So you can export K6 browser enabled and set that to true. And then you don't have to use a separate command anymore. So before, you have to use xk6 browser run and then the name of the script. But now you can just natively use, the k6 command and just pass in the file that you want to run. So hopefully this should work as expected. Oh, check is not defined. I forgot to import check.
I actually have a question. I'm not, maybe this is to Teo. Marie, you mentioned that you had to use an environment variable to make sure that the K6 browser module was going to be enabled. Now, is that just a browser
Mhm.
thing, or is it like that for the other experimental modules as well?
I think it's specific to the browser, if I'm not mistaken. And I think the
Yeah.
main reason is because the browser brings a whole new universe of dependencies that the other modules don't have. Because of course,
Yeah.
for a browser, you need a lot of things you need to start a lot of things and so on and so forth. Go ahead, Mary, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, yeah, I think it's just browser specific. It's more of like a security consideration as well, because we don't want to necessarily, just launch the browser even if we're running protocol level tests. So we want to explicitly just launch the browser if we are using the browser module. But I think it's only temporary for now. So maybe in future releases, we'll remove that environment variable. But yeah, for now, it is a requirement that in order for you to run the browser test, you have to set that variable. Because I think if you forget to set it, then there's just a friendly error message that gets printed that says, oh, I think it looks like you're trying to run a browser test. Have you set this environment variable? Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Good to know.
Let me just go ahead and run that. So it was failing because I forgot to import the check from K6. And these are messages, so don't worry about this. So these are actual errors coming in from the test application, not necessarily from your test script. So if you open up the application that I just showed and looked at the console, you'll see the same error. So this isn't necessarily related to the browser module. Yeah. So you can see here that the two checks that I've added in, it's paused. So basically, I was doing a check if the item name and the item quantity is what I expect. And then once it's finished, so whatever summary metrics you saw when you were using XK6 browser as an extension, you also see them as part of K6 natively now. Um, and what might be a great segue is I know because the question a while ago from Max, and then Nicole said that, yep, on the same script, you can even have a browser level tests where you have one or two virtual users that visits a particular action, and then at the same time you have your actual protocol level tests. So on the GitHub project, so in here you can see how you can do both. So this is using two functions. So this async function, I've just named it browser test to make it more explicit. This is exactly the same function that I've just showed in terms of the demo. And then in here you have your K6 protocol tests, and it's just basically doing a get request. And if you want to execute them simultaneously, you can just use the K6 scenarios for this. And you can define, what kind of executor you want, like how many virtual users, what's the duration. For this example, I've just used the per view, and by default, I think this will just run one view from a browser level, doing one iteration. So you can just pretty much mix and match all the modules here as well. So maybe have the tracing module, added, and have that in a single script. So it's all, I guess, like easy to configure as well. Yeah, I think that
Awesome.
is it from the demo.
Okay, great. Thank you, Marie. I am curious though, Teo, so we already have seen the ones that are out there already. Can you tell us some other ones that maybe we might see soon?
The only one that comes to my mind now, but on the other hand, it's close to 6, so my brain might be fried, is one I'm working on at the moment. So a long requested feature, I found issues in our repository that date back, sorry, plural, back to 2018, if I'm not mistaken, is cryptographic, a more extensive cryptographic functions support in K6. At the moment, we have a crypto module which supports mostly some cryptographically secure random number generation and some digest calculations. And at the moment, we are working towards landing the Web Crypto API specification support in K6. So what that really means is soon, partially in the upcoming release, and maybe fully in some future releases. There will be support for generating, importing, exporting cryptographic keys, whether they're symmetric, asymmetric, so key pairs, or using elliptic curve algorithms. And we also want to support and will support at some point, probably not this release, but maybe next one, encryption and signing. So that will allow users who rely for their application on encryption keys to do certain operations, the ability to sign certain packets in a certain way, for instance, when you use JSON Web Tokens or things like this. This will allow them to fulfill these actions. And it will probably also open the door to more extensions that support protocols that depend on these very specific functionalities.
I think
Okay,
if I remember, we had one office hours episode, the AMA with the champions, and I think if I remember correctly, even the K6 operator, like in terms of the distributed um way of running your tests, I think there are plans as well to have that as an experimental module. I don't know if Paul is still part of the chat, but yeah, maybe Paul can confirm that. But I think, yeah, there are also plans to have that to be part of basic some experimental modules.
Oh, I always love to like volunteer people when they're not here. So yeah, Paul is totally working on that, and it's going to be out in the next release, if not tomorrow.
No pressure, Paul.
Yeah. So Teo, since you've been working on this a lot, what are there any other extensions that you would like to eventually see in as an experimental module? And obviously we won't hold you to it much.
So there are internal discussions, of course. There are things that we observe and we see our users care for, and some of them we also as a company care for. And among them, the first ones that come to my mind are MQTT, Kafka, HTTP3 also is a topic. It's a pretty hot protocol at the moment. I'm not yet very, very clear on HTTP2. I know HTTP2, but like apparently HTTP3 is already a thing. I know that we would really like to support TCP natively in K6, maybe DNS. I think in general, we're really looking to expand the basis of technologies and protocols that are really widespread within our user base and attempt to get them as experimental modules. And I do think that the goal here is not to have everything as an experimental module. It's not to take every extensions out there and put them in the repo and cross our fingers that everything go well, because we have a limited bandwidth for maintaining these modules. But what we really want to actually lend as modules are functionalities, technologies, protocols that are either things that we need and benefit from as a company, or that our users have been asking for a very long time, or that we observe them using quite a lot.
I have some things that that I'd love to see as experimental modules. Some of them you already mentioned. I thought HTTP3 and Kafka are like slam dunks. And also the HTML dashboards by, like, I know there's one by Ivan Skiba. I just think that would be a really easy way to visualize without needing something else. Paul is in the chat. He says operator isn't an extension, so it's not going to be an experimental module, and it is very specific. But he also mentioned too that we're on my list, XK6 Kubernetes, which is an extension that lets you carry out Kubernetes commands within a K6 script. I think that K6 is used a lot by cloud native folks, so I think this is an easy one to add. Oh, I mean, not easy from a technical perspective, but easy as in it would be awesome to have it. And XK6 Disruptor, which is in the field of chaos engineering. And Paul, of course, he's our ecosystem person. He's saying it's super easy to build a custom K6 binary now. So, no real need to make everything an experimental module. Maybe let's talk about that. You also touched on this, Teo. When should something be an experimental module? And then when should something be part of core?
That's a great question that we don't necessarily have a strict answer to. At the moment, this is really based on. There is a big aspect of like, is it a key technology? Is it a key protocol? Is it something that's like, just like HTTP is the base of most of the internet nowadays, we can expect all our users to benefit from that. And if we see an opportunity like this, then I guess we would and we should consider making it an experimental module, given that we care about actually introducing that in K6. On the other hand, just like Paul mentions, it's quite easy. I wouldn't say easy, but it's not that tricky to build an extension nowadays. So if our users have a very corner case or something that we haven't implemented or that our community hasn't implemented yet, there are, I don't remember the exact number, but it's in the hundreds. We have hundreds of extensions out there to get inspiration from, and it's doable to actually implement it as an extension. The thing is, there is no one answer that fits all, because some extensions like the one you showed, distributed tracing, we ended up taking most of the code base, refactoring it a bit, changing the API we show to users and turn it into an experimental module. Yeah, and I see Pavel mentioning that in the core, it's something I completely forgot to mention. We care about technologies that are open source. So in the core, we would never, don't quote me on that, but we would never merge a module that provides support for close proprietary technology. So that's also another aspect.
Well, I don't think we need to quote you because Pavel is our CTO,
Yeah.
and here's a quotable quote right here. It is never going to happen, which I'm very
Good.
happy about. But I also think I like what Paul said about how it's okay to make it experimental if it's less than 5 MB. I think this is part of the K6 philosophy of keeping things composable and performant. We don't want to put everything in the kitchen sink into K6 and then have most people only use like 70% of what it can do. We want to ship with that 70% and then allow them to easily add in the things that they need, right? So my question is, do we know yet if experimental is like a step in the process of going to core, or it sounds like there are some that will be experimental but never part of core, so it's not like a graduation timeline. It's more just like a way to distinguish between how important it is, how important we see it is for K6.
It's I actually completely forgot to talk about that, I realize, but what we put in experimental. So first, there is no clear-cut answer, even within the team at the moment, on what module is going to come out of experimental and become like a standard module that you import as K6 / the name of the module. So this is not decided. I think we have a shared assumption that most of them will end up becoming core modules, but there is no clear-cut decision made on this, as far as I'm aware, at least. But that actually allows me to touch on something. The reason why they're called experimental is because we actually put the effort to bring them to a level of quality, or to implement them up to a level of quality that we care about at K6, because we care about providing a great user experience and we care about our software being performant. But the reason they're called experimental is because that's what they are. So there are two things we expect from them. One is to find out, are they stable enough? Are there things we forgot? Are there things that don't work as expected in there? Are there bugs we haven't figured out yet? And the other aspect is to also express that, just that it might not be stable. It might be broken in some way. We think in general it works as expected and it fulfills the mission we set for ourselves for this module, but don't expect it to work 100% because it's very likely not the case yet. And also it's a way to also express the fact that we reserve ourselves the right to completely break it and to change the API completely if we realize that, well, we messed that up. It doesn't work well or it doesn't lead to a good user experience. So the bottom line is, I think the goal is to land them in core eventually. How long that takes is not clear. And also, this time that we have is used to stabilize it, which means we reserve ourselves the right to change it along the way. But the bottom line, although we don't have agreement, is yes, to answer your question, they should land in core eventually.
Some comments from Pavel here. He said, this is a snippet from the K6 vision document. The K6 platform aims to support protocols and technologies commonly used for building modern, cloud-native, distributed systems. And so what that means is that supporting popular protocols is all about letting our users become productive without having to add a lot of stuff. So they don't have to build extensions themselves, or, we're trying to reduce all of that work for the most popular use cases. And he also says the first thing a K6 user does is to work on solving their problem rather than wrangling with a tool. The tool should feel like batteries are included in the core. Yeah, because everyone's going to need batteries, right? So maybe not extended batteries or super portable batteries or batteries that can be charged with USB-C, but some batteries should be included in the core. Théo, since you mentioned that part of the reason that we have experimental modules is so that we can iterate on them and get feedback, what should people do if they are using an experimental module and want to provide some feedback?
Well, as an open source product and project, we use GitHub for everything. And one of the strength of having them as experimental modules is that if people open issues on the K6 repository and explicitly mark them as being about an extension or an experimental module, we will see them and we will treat them the same way as we treat every other issues that are brought about K6 itself. So the best way is to go on the GitHub repository of K6, which is github.com/grafana/K6, and to open an issue there. And in general, we're quite reactive and we consider and try to prioritize their resolution for all of them. We actually review them on a regular basis. So please, if you spot something or if you have a feature request for some of them, or if you find a bug or something like that, feel free to go ahead and open an issue and provide us with what you expected, what you observed, and what you and we will try to provide some support in either moving forward with your requests or try to fix the bug you experienced.
And would this also be the best place to go if somebody wants an extension to become an experimental module?
I don't think so. And I'm speaking as an engineer here because issues are really there to be about what exists there. For feature requests, I would rather either contact our customer support team, but I'm not sure. I don't want to I don't want to create traffic and make some people in trouble. No, I think they should get in contact probably through the forum or on our public Slack, I would say. Maybe open a discussion there is probably the best place. Yeah, but the issues really are about what is already there, I would say. Feature requests are not really... Well, That's not really true. If for certain feature requests that are very, very specific to K6, like this specific API at this point doesn't do the thing the way we want it to do, this is fine. But I would say that for, I want this extension to become an experimental module, that this is not the place.
I think that the community support forum is a good, safe one. I think a lot of the stuff that goes to support are usually for customers, and this community forum is more OSS focused. And since experimental modules are mainly an OSS thing, I think it makes sense to put it in the support in the community forum. So I think that was a good call there. Okay, so we are out of time, unfortunately. Next week, we're going to talk about something super exciting. It is we have been waiting to release this. It's something that many people on in Grafana, including the K6 team, have been really excited about. It's basically something that's going to put K6 on the map for all Grafana users. So join us next week for a discussion on something we're calling Grafana Cloud K6. And thank you, Marie and Théo, for joining me
Thank you.
today.
Thank you.
Hope you all
Thank you
had
so
fun,
much.
and thanks
Yeah.
everybody who is watching. See you all next week.
Bye
Bye.
bye.